David, if you would like, you can commence to introduce the topic, and Golda will be joining us in a little.
Okay, sounds good. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Excellent. So thanks everyone for coming today. Golda and I wanted to discuss today the Skynet kernel and trustless browser extensions and what we can do to enable people on the web using a web browser to get the same sort of security guarantees that you can expect to get when downloading a client to your desktop and running, say, a blockchain full node or a BitTorrent client or some other peer-to-peer software. So typically when you do peer-to-peer on the web, you connect to a website and that website gives you source code that you run or that your browser runs. And you are completely trusting that website to give you the source code that you're expecting. So the web is generally for peer-to-peer software significantly less secure than a desktop environment. However, using browser extensions, we've been able to create something called the kernel, which allows us to upgrade the security level of the web to the same level that you can expect from your desktop. So that's what we've been working on and what we'll be talking about today, and something that I'm very excited to be presenting on. I can give a little bit more background about myself. So I'm David Vorick. I've been working in the blockchain space for about, 10 years now, 11 years now. I've been working on peer-to-peer storage and file sharing for about 8 years. My big introduction to the space was Saya. I co-founded the Saya blockchain with Luke Champagne in 2014. We launched it into production in 2015. Today, there are almost 3,000 terabytes of storage of data being stored on the Saya network. In 2020, we discovered a way to make make Saya able to share files with other people, and so over the web. And so we upgraded Saya to a thing called Skynet that allows you to do file sharing and web application hosting, and in full maturity you can do things like a fully decentralized YouTube or a fully decentralized TikTok on a blockchain in a fully trustless way, where you use it entirely from the web browser. And so it's exciting to be here, and I'm glad you're able to join me.
I'm glad you're able to join us too. Golda seems to be having some issues, but she's asking if you can tell us about this new version and how is it more secure and if it's signed.
I'm sorry, can you ask that one more time?
Yeah, she said, ask him why this new version is more secure. Is it signed?
Yeah, so the major thing that we do with the Skynet kernel is that we verify the hashes and signatures of every piece of data you receive from Skynet. And this actually extends beyond Skynet. You can do this to any website. So using the Skynet kernel, when you download a web application, the kernel has in the browser local storage a hash alongside like a developer signature that states what code you should be receiving. And so before the request hits your web browser, like before the page loads, the browser extension can actually check the incoming data, check the incoming application, make sure that the data matches the hash and that the hash has been signed by the developer or whatever trusted entity is creating this application, thereby guaranteeing to the user that the application has loaded successfully. And if the hash doesn't match, or if the signature doesn't match, the web browser just won't load the page. It'll display an error rather than load potentially malicious code.
Okay, so thank you so much. I still have another question that is related to security. So why does this release increase the security?
That's so interesting. So we are still trusting the kernel, or how do we know we can trust it for sure?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
The Skynet kernel itself is around 2,000 lines of source code. It's completely open source, and then you can install it in your web browser, either through an extension like the app extension store, or you can install it yourself using the developer tooling. And so you can audit the code. You can see that the Skynet kernel does what it claims, and then once it's installed into your browser, you have confidence that because the code can be audited, and because the code is not like swapped out in real time, you know that the code you are running is the code that you expected to run. And so, again, the major difference between this and your typical web browser experience is that every time you go to, say, twitter.com, you completely reload the code. And so even if Twitter was open source, there's no guarantee that the open source code is actually the code that your browser received and is running. There's no, without a browser extension, there's no way to confirm that the relationship between those two is correct. And so you can open source one piece of code and then serve another piece of code and no one's going to know. But with the browser extension, because you actually install it into the web browser, you know that when you read the source code and then you install the resulting extension that you build, you know that the source code you read is the same code that was used to install your extension. And then from there, that extension can act as like a governor or like a watchman across all the other code that you load from the web. And so you go from this place where you don't have any control over what code you're loading to you do have complete control over every piece of code that you load. Does that make sense?
Yes, of course. This sounds like a really good idea, and I was just wondering if there is any other app or any other browser extensions that are doing the sign of if your kernel is the first one to do this.
Can you ask the question one more time? You broke up a little bit.
Yes, sorry, I have bad connection. I was wondering, like, this is such a good idea. So I was wondering if there are any other extensions, any other kernels that are in Skynet that do something like this. Of if you guys are the first one doing this.
Within the Skynet ecosystem, we're the first ones. I know that there's another extension called Lume. I don't know exactly how Lume works, but I know that they took a lot of the similar ideas of the Skynet extension and made another way to securely load things off of Skynet. And then in the broader crypto ecosystem, I don't think there's any extension that's explicitly focused on making web pages secure. However, you have extensions like MetaMask, which have similar security concerns, especially around handling the user seed safely. And so something like MetaMask works to achieve similar goals to the Skynet kernel. So like the Skynet kernel will, check the hash on something like twitter.com for you. Whereas MetaMask is really more focused on the user seed, but MetaMask is another example of an application that will give the user confidence that when they put their seed into a web page, it's not going to some bad guy, it's code that's been audited, and they know the relationship between the open source code and the code that's installed in their browser. So there are similar ideas to this in the crypto space, but what makes the Skynet kernel special is that it's not concerned just with Skynet calls, but can actually get between any request that the user makes, any application that the user loads, and this would include decentralizing existing applications that are already centralized. The user can get in the middle and take control for themselves and make sure that the APIs they're using or the apps they're using are decentralized versions of what developers originally built.
In practice, what kinds of websites or applications do you see this being most useful for?
Yeah, so one thing that I think is a big potential for this type of thing is decentralized apps like OpenSea, where OpenSea comes from like the crypto ecosystem. It has a decentralized ethos, but then at the end of the day, everyone's just making calls to a centralized database. And what you can do is you can create a module or a driver for the Skynet kernel that will intercept these OpenSea requests, and instead of sending them to a centralized database, it will inject a decentralized API and allow, say web apps, like if you're on Twitter and Twitter is on the back end talking to OpenSea to figure out if an NFT is real, what the kernel can do is it can take Twitter's request to OpenSea and replace it with a request to an actually decentralized API. And so you will be able to, even though Twitter was built in a centralized way, you will be able to make your Twitter experience look at the decentralized version of the API. And so that's like one example of a place where we see this being very powerful. And then, of course, for other places, it's just like if you have, say, a Dropbox or a decentralized version of Dropbox, you want to know that your files are safe, that your files are being stored according to the rules that you set, and that some corporation's not going to introduce new terms of service or delete files without your consent, or any sort of, we've seen Dropbox do a lot of invasive sort of action based on various policies that they've set retroactively. And so if you're using the Skynet kernel for a more traditional application, like a non-crypto application, it can also provide you protection against a corporation that's otherwise, say, stealing your data.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so my question is, give me a minute. I'll just ask. I'll ask later. A minute, please. You can go on.
Is someone else trying to talk? I don't hear them.
I
Okay,
could ask another
so this is-
question. In the meantime, would someone like a Twitter have to create a decentralized version of what they have, or a Dropbox create a decentralized version of what they have in order for the Skynet kernel to activate, or is it work in a different way?
So the Skynet kernel can basically be active on any web page. The browser API gives it the ability to interfere essentially with any web request. And so that means that Twitter does not need to upgrade in any way in order for the Skynet kernel to start acting on behalf of the user and decentralizing pieces of the Twitter stack.
Okay, so right now I can ask my question. So is it specific to Skynet, or it is more general? What is the requirement of the format that can be verified?
I'm not sure if we touched this once already, but she asked if there was any limitation to the format of the code being verified. What's the protocol for the code that can be verified?
Can you hear me?
And is it for the Skynet ecosystem
Can you hear me, David?
only, or to be used more broadly?
So I hear two people talking at once, but it sounds like they can't hear each other, and so they're talking over each other. Can someone confirm if that's happening, or is it just me?
I'm hearing that also.
Okay. So I think I heard both questions. I'll answer them in order. So the first question was, I believe, is the Skynet kernel limited to Skynet? And the answer to that is mostly no. So the Skynet kernel depends on Skynet to bootstrap itself. The way that files are stored on Skynet has both a immutable file store and a database file store. The immutable file store is all hash-based. The database file store is all signature-based. And so the Skynet kernel needs to talk to Skynet in order to load itself. And so if a user says, like, if a user does something like, say, replaces OpenSea with a decentralized version of OpenSea, the Skynet kernel needs to actually load that replacement from Skynet. However, if someone wants to build, say, a decentralized Dropbox and use the Skynet kernel to guarantee that the correct code is in place, but then they actually want to use, say, Arweave to store all of the user's data, that's something that's completely possible to do. So at the moment, you can't use the Skynet kernel without Skynet. However, it's not exclusive to Skynet. If you want to use, if you want to make a crypto application that's using pieces of Ethereum, pieces of Filecoin, pieces of Solana, you can absolutely do that with the Skynet kernel.
Okay.
And then I heard the second question, but I forgot it. So if you could re-ask.
Okay, so it was, what is the requirement of the format that can be verified? So that was the last thing. And I also have another question. What are the requirements for the Skynet kernel to verify the web page? And what is the format of or protocol for the signature?
Okay, yeah, so basically the Skynet kernel expects to see a web page getting served. And so it will, when you load a web page securely, it has a reference point for what that web request is supposed to look like. And that includes response headers, that includes metadata, and it includes the page data itself. And so all of this gets hashed up into using a Merkle tree into a Merkle root. And so we Merkleize it all so that we can do range requests as well. And so the server that the Skynet kernel talks to will also supply a Merkle proof that the data that's being served is correct. And then it all gets signed using, I believe, ed25519. And so you have data that's hashed from a Merkle root. That Merkle root's signed by ed25519. And then if you're just loading a piece of a page or a piece of an application, a Merkle proof can be supplied that will allow you to verify that everything's aligned. And so if you're injecting an entire application, generally that application is going to load fully from Skynet. So whatever request the web browser makes, the kernel's going to suffocate that request, make an alternative request to Skynet, and then load data from Skynet. And otherwise, it's just going to have a plain hash that it's going to check, and it's going to make sure the data coming back matches the plain hash. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Okay, sure. Thank you. So is there anyone who has a question in the audience? Feel free to ask your question.
Does this work also when interfacing with, let's say, like Solidity smart contracts within a DeFi application? Would it work the same way that it essentially verifies that what's being sent is being sent to the application that is authentic, the one that I think I'm connecting to?
Yeah, so that happens in a slightly different way. Basically, let's say you're using Uniswap, and so you're using okay, so if you're using a secure Uniswap front end that you just loaded from Skynet, you actually don't have to worry. But if you're using, another front end, and you're talking to, say, Infura, and you don't know if Infura is talking to the correct contract, what you can do is you can build a kernel module that replaces Infura, and it will, again, when your DeFi application talks to an Ethereum backend, the kernel will suffocate those queries and replace them with your decentralized module. And so if you want like guarantees that you're talking to the correct application and that you're definitely, getting to the Ethereum network and that there's no like centralized entity in the middle, for talking to Solidity contracts, you have a one extra step to go because you also have to solve the Infura problem. But you can do that by writing a kernel module. So it's a little bit more work than a secure front end, but it's completely feasible and something that we hope to start supporting.
Well, I have a quick one. You just mentioned that there were immutable file stores, and I just want to see what's your take on the like a permanent web kind of thing. Let's say AR Weave, what they are doing and how Skynet will fit into this picture. I don't want to be very dramatic, but one of my friend who is very deep in the AR Weave world, he has said something dramatic. He said the start of the AR Weave might be the end of the Ethereum. I might not buy in what he said, but it's a little bit too much dramatic emotion there when he say that. But I would like to see what's your take on the AR Weave and the Skynet. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that there are pros and cons to each. And because of that, there's situations where Skynet makes more sense, and there are situations where Arweave makes more sense. The main thing that kind of separates the two is that Arweave is substantially more expensive. So if you want to upload, say, a 1 hour talk, a video presentation on Arweave, that might cost you several $100s. Storage on Arweave is very expensive, whereas on Skynet, that's probably only going to cost you like 2 or 3 cents, and someone might even do it for you for free because it's so cheap. So we have structured Skynet to be, I guess, not temporary storage, but the guarantees are months or years. It's like the duration of your account rather than forever. And so if you're doing something like birth records or specific metadata or huge historical events or really small data like important blog posts or important journal articles, that's something where the expense of Arweave really makes sense, and it's going to shine as a medium. But I do think that Arweave fits into a specific niche, and that niche does not overlap with either Ethereum or Skynet. I think all three platforms are kind of pointed at solving different problems, and that any one of them doing super well is not going to like crowd out or end any of the other platforms. I think there's lots of room for all three platforms to be super successful.
Okay, sure. So is there anyone else who has a question? Feel free to ask. This is your time now.
So I noticed, and I saw on your website, there's a Polkadot integration. Is the team looking to integrate with other layer 1 or even layer 2 networks? And if so, what does that roadmap look like?
Yeah, so we think that there are a lot of places, especially, so like stepping back one step, most users interact with crypto today over the web. And most of those interactions happen through centralized front ends where the users have no control over what code they're actually running in their web browser. And they don't know if they're talking to the right smart contract. They don't know if they're talking to the right blockchain. They don't know, usually they know that their seed is not being stolen because they have a browser extension for that. But beyond that, they really don't know what they're doing when they're signing messages with an application. And so we want to leverage Skynet, we want to leverage home screen and the kernel to solve that weakness for other applications in the ecosystem. And in some cases, it's preventative. Like, there's no historical evidence of the front end being abused. But in other cases, like, for example, OpenSea or Uniswap, there's a history of censoring applications or censoring users or removing assets from the front end. And so by having users switch to Skynet, we can give them a level of control that is transparently missing, and so from other parts of the ecosystem. So yeah, we are hoping to identify and then solve key centralization points elsewhere in the crypto ecosystem. And Polkadot's one partner that we're excited about. 1inch is a partner that we're excited about, and there are several more in the pipeline that we hope to build these roads and give the whole crypto ecosystem a stronger and more end-to-end use of decentralization.
Awesome, thanks for answering that. So two questions. The first is, like in 5 years down the road, do you anticipate, or would you imagine a future where most users of the web would have presumably this Skynet extension installed, and then they use that to interface with any kind of application that is within the Web3 ecosystem?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. So we actually have a bit even more ambitious plans for the Skynet kernel. We were very careful when we coded it up to make the base Skynet kernel very small and very stable. And so we have this core that's like 2,000 lines of code that, if we did everything correctly, should never need to be modified, which means it has a very low maintenance burden for any browser or browser extension that adds that code as like a first-class citizen. So in the medium term, our plan is to work with extensions that are already super popular, like MetaMask or like Kepler or Tally or some of the other major crypto extensions, and just have them add this Skynet code to their browser extension. That way, users who are already in the crypto ecosystem get Skynet support without having to install a specific Skynet extension. And this has an added benefit of, if you already have a crypto seed, so when you use Skynet, you need a seed. If Skynet integrates with MetaMask, you don't need a seed specific to Skynet. Your MetaMask seed can actually be used for your Skynet identity as well. And so in the medium term, we have a plan to significantly lower the barrier to entry, open up the ecosystem substantially to all of crypto. And then in the long term, we actually think that it's reasonable to install the Skynet extension just like in the web browser itself. And so every instance of Firefox can just ship with this Skynet kernel, these 2,000 lines of code just automatically like in the base layer. And that way every web user has access to these decentralized APIs, even if they, even if all they've done is switch to Firefox or switch to Chrome. So yeah, we're excited about the potential for that, and we've been very conscientious or like very thoughtful around what sort of maintenance burden and like what is the burden that we put on MetaMask, or what is the burden that we put on the Firefox developers if they decide to make Skynet a first-class piece of the browser. And we've made that footprint as tiny as possible, and we've made that ask as tiny as possible. So it just makes sense, and we hope that we can get these integrations in place, within the next year.
That's awesome. Super ambitious, and also necessary, just with, I think, everything that we've seen up to this point around protecting end users and some of the nefarious things I think that we've seen in Web3 just by nature. I won't spend too much time talking on this, but I work at the Hedera network, and one thing that we've been focused on is privacy for users, and we just launched a fund for privacy-focused applications similar to Skynet. So I can reach out to you afterwards, but would be interested in that kind of availability and integration for applications on the Hedera network. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to chat. Shoot me a DM and we can set something up.
Awesome. Thanks.
Super. Is there anyone else want to ask a question? Feel free to do so. Maybe I can ask. I have a few questions. So, are there some libraries that app developers can use? Could a classic Web2 dev also use them?
Sorry, can you ask that one more time?
Are there some libraries that app developers can use? Could a classic Web2 developer also use them?
Gotcha. Yes. So the Skynet libraries are all written in common JavaScript. So if you're familiar with Gatsby or React, you can use Gatsby and React to make decentralized applications and leverage the Skynet kernel. So you do not need to be a blockchain specific developer or a blockchain expert in order to be able to use the Skynet kernel and the Skynet APIs and libraries.
Oh, okay, sure. So I also have another question. Is this only for dApps, or is it also for classic HTTP requests?
Yep, it works with standard classic HTTP requests. And if we wanted to get like a little bit ambitious with, some way that we could use it, one thing that you could imagine, and there's actually an app in the ecosystem that's kind of already doing this called Maskbook, is that you could hijack an existing application like Twitter or Facebook, and you could say either replace the DM system with a decentralized DM system, or you could, replace it with feeds that are loading from a blockchain, and so you can merge these things together. So yeah, you don't need to be making a dApp specifically. You can be making a web application, and then even on top of that, you don't need to be the owner of a web application in order to be making modifications to it. Maskbook is already showing that, even though they don't own Twitter, they don't control Twitter, they've been able to make a browser extension that augments Twitter, adds features, adds privacy protections, and enriches the user experience entirely permissionlessly. And so Skynet Kernel is kind of taking this to the next level and making it more general and more open to everyone.
Oh, okay, sure. Browser extensions are really powerful. Usually the barrier is with adoption. The size of the library sounds like a plus. What do you think about the driver? What do you think will drive the adoption?
That's a great question, and I do think that one of the things that you have to be careful about when talking about decentralization is you don't want to solve a problem, because then no one's going to use you until like that problem is very immediate. You have to, if you want to drive adoption, you really have to build something that people could never use anywhere else. And so I see the Skynet kernel starting to gain adoption when people start adding APIs for monetization to platforms that already exist. And so, one example could be integrating the Skynet kernel with YouTube. Again, kind of offensively, this isn't something that Google is necessarily permitting, but you could imagine like a deeper integration between YouTube and say something like Patreon or something like NFTs. And so you're browsing YouTube and you just automatically, every video on YouTube has an NFT associated with it that you can buy. And so I don't know exactly what that pull is going to be just yet, but I know that we can use decentralization to enable people to do things that they can't do in the centralized world, and to share data in ways that you can't share in the centralized world. And so our focus for getting major adoption on the Skynet kernel, and I think just in general for Web3, is going to be focused around monetization, letting people own their data, letting people make money when other people find their data valuable, and then building an economy that was never able to exist in Web 2.
Oh yeah, super ambitious. So I'm also having another question. Like, can the web page detect that it is being loaded by the Skynet kernel? It should. If it asks you for a signature, right?
It depends on, so naively, the web page is not going to know that the Skynet kernel is operating. However, if you wanted to build your web page so that it could detect when the Skynet kernel was active, you probably could.
Okay, sure. Thank you. So, anyone who have a question, kindly feel free to ask. I received another question. So, saying already answered. So if you're comfortable with HTTP request and JavaScript, it can work well with the oh. Okay, so do you have any closing remarks?
No, I think we covered a broad range of stuff. I would just say that I think I'm very excited to be building this. The big thing that hit me like a month and a half ago was that we can use the Skynet kernel to re-decentralize things that are centralized. And so for the past 8 years of building, I've really been looking at things from the angle of we have to rebuild the internet. And like we have to convince users to switch off of this centralized thing and onto this decentralized thing. But the more that I play around and grow the kernel and like just code with the Skynet kernel, the more I realize that we may not have to tell users to switch from the centralized thing to the decentralized thing. We can be more proactive and more combative, and we can take a centralized thing like Gmail, and through tools like Massbook and like Skynet kernel and through browser extensions, we can actually force Gmail on behalf of the user to be a fully decentralized application. And so this has given me a lot of excitement around what we can do and what sorts of adoption we can hit and just how much easier we can make the transition from this like lockdown, super siloed world to this open and free, you know, people own their own data world. And so I think that the further we get with this technology, the more it seems like this technology is very viable and isn't going to require like a mass re-education of consumers. We're going to be able to make a seamless transition from people using centralized services to all of a sudden those services are now decentralized, and the consumer doesn't even have to change their habits. They can just keep using Gmail, but now they get a decentralized version of it. So I guess that would be my closing remark. I think there's a lot of promise in this area of development. That's why I've started spending all of my time here. And I think we have a bright future, and that we actually have a chance at taking back control from Facebook, Google, and Amazon, and we can put the users back in the driver's seat of the internet.
Okay, sure. So somebody requested, maybe you can go on.
Hey, David, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thanks for that summary, actually, and thanks for all of your hard work. I joined the call late, so I don't know to what extent you guys covered tokenomics of the project, but along those lines, how does this product fit into? And I like your responses about adoption. You're absolutely right. The need has to be there for people to the need has to be immediate, right, for people to take advantage of whatever the solution is or whatever problem you're trying to solve. But how does this pivot lend itself into the tokenomics of the project? And what are your thoughts on what you see happening with the project in this year? And I know it's a very general question, but I just wanted to, first of all, just wanted to spend some time on tokenomics and how this fits into the overall roadmap.
Yeah, so I do think tokenomics is actually like a totally separate topic and would need its own full Twitter space. But I would say, similar to the way that the Skynet kernel gets in the middle of these API requests to make them secure, the Skynet kernel also gets in the middle of these API requests to make them incentivized. And so we have a vision with Skynet where it's like if you write a library that's valuable and that people use, every time that library runs, you should get a little bit of payment. And depending on how important the library is, that payment might be very small. But it's like today in the JavaScript ecosystem, when you compile the kernel, you get when you run npm run build, you get a little message that says something like 87 projects are looking for funding. 87 of your dependencies are looking for funding. And to me, that's just like a big opportunity for the space. If you have a project that's being used by a framework, if you're a dependency of React and React is being accessed by 1 billion people every day who are interacting with that library that you've built, you should not have to put a little compile time message that says, hey, I'm looking for funding. That payment should just be in the middle of all that usage. And so payment should just naturally flow to you. And so I can't go into the details because we don't have enough time, and I think it's a little out of scope. But that's the problem that we're looking to solve. Our tokenomics are focused around making sure that every contributor to the web ecosystem is getting paid their fair share. And again, today, React, built by Facebook, used by billions of people, Facebook's making hundreds of billions of dollars a year in profit off of libraries that are built by people who don't get paid at all. And so we want to fix that. And I think that's all I can say on tokenomics for now.
Great response, and I totally agree with you. there's a need. But if you could just, and I respect the fact that you can't talk in depth about tokenomics, but you can just spend, how do you see these payments happening though within the Skynet kernel? Is it going to be the CR coin that's going to be used? You're going to leverage? And if you don't want to answer that just yet, that's okay as well. But I'm just trying to see how the networks, currency, what are the network's currency is going to be leveraged to get these payments through.
Yeah, so Siacoin will continue to be used as the currency for storage and bandwidth. So Sia has always been an infrastructure play, and as Skynet continues to use the Sia infrastructure, it will use Siacoin for that. Monetization is a completely separate concern with a completely different network design, and so that's going to use its own blockchain.
Gotcha. Thanks for sharing some light on that, and it would be great if we could have another space specifically around tokenomics. That would be great if that's not too much to ask.
For sure, we'll host something like that soon.
Awesome. Thanks, David. Thanks for all the great work. Really appreciate it.
Okay, so is there anyone who has the last question? We are taking questions as we wrap up. If there's no question, maybe we can, this is my last question. I have like 3 questions. So are there incentivized for the app dev or for the user? Will the app not work unless it goes through the Skynet Kernel? The idea is that the app will get.
It depends on how the app was built. So if you want to build your app in a way that it loads without the Skynet kernel, and so a user who doesn't have the Skynet kernel can use your app and then is in is trusting your server, you can build it that way, and you can build it so that the user trusts you unless they have the kernel, and then it's trustless. And you can also build the app such that it does not work unless the user has the Skynet kernel. So it really depends on you as a developer what approach you want to take. I think most of our tutorials are going to be focused around fully decentralized apps that are fully dependent on the Skynet kernel, but it's completely possible to make applications that look for the Skynet kernel, and if they don't find it, they fall back to just a trusted server, and they do things the normal way, thereby ensuring that users don't need a specific browser extension in order to use your application.
Oh, okay. It will always be possible with a browser extension, but instead the use of a browser extension is the key. I see why the app dev might want it. Yeah. So this is my last question. Actually, it's not a question; it's a request. If people want to run out and try it, please drop us the links to try it as an app dev, and we'll retweet that.
Okay, we'll send you the links. Just to be clear, the Skynet kernel is still in development. So it's open source and the code's available, and it does run and has a test suite, but it doesn't have any example applications yet. So we'll go ahead and we'll send you the links, and we'll tweet it out later. But it's github.com/Skynet Labs/Skynet-kernel, or if you just Google Skynet kernel GitHub, Google should show you the right repo. And again, it's still early stage. It's not out of beta. It's a little buggy. There's not a whole lot you can do with it yet. But we have the code and it's all open source.
Okay, great. Thank you everyone for coming, for joining this Twitter space. Actually, it has been a good time here. We've really learned a lot, and we are looking forward to host more. Thank you. Unless anyone has other closing remarks, I guess we'll wrap it up there. Thank you.
Okay, it was great to be here, and thank you everyone for coming and listening in.